early 19th century, the 1800s, many countries in Central and Latin and America and the Caribbean islands had wars of liberation. Many European countries were more concerned about Europe than they were about these colonial holdings. So many countries did find their independence during the early 1800s. Now, because places like Spain were no longer holding these small island countries, Great Britain stepped in and started to create strong trade relationships with these smaller countries. After the Napoleonic Wars are over and these monarchs are restored, they're put back into power, they wanted to create their colonial holdings again in the Western Hemisphere. Now, the United States and Great Britain decided to work together to try to keep those colonial powers from coming back into the Western Hemisphere. President Monroe issues the Monroe Doctrine. Essentially, the Monroe Doctrine was a warning to European countries to not come into the Western Hemisphere and try to reestablish those colonial holdings. In return, the United States said that they would stay in the Western Hemisphere and that Europe could worry about the European countries. So the Monroe Doctrine is basically the idea that Europeans should stay in Europe and the United States will control the Western Hemisphere and Latin America. But you have to remember that in the early 1800s, the United States really had no military power to speak of, especially no naval power. So early on, the United States was reliant largely on the British Navy to enforce this Monroe Doctrine, which is slightly ironic. It's going to be used later, so it's not really important in the early 1800s, but the Monroe Doctrine becomes very important later on, especially under the Teddy Roosevelt presidency in controlling what's called the Roosevelt Corollary. We're going to control those Latin American countries and collect their debts and try to keep the Europeans out again. It's also going to be important when we get into World War I and World War II, the idea that European wars are happening in Europe. We're going to stay here in the Western Hemisphere, and we're just going to worry about ourselves. So the Monroe Doctrine, while it doesn't have a whole lot of impact early on in our country's history, it has a great deal of impact around the 1900s and on.